Hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell. I'm Associate Counsel for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And for our first show of the new year, we thought we'd give a preview of 2023. So we're going to discuss what we here at FFRF are watching and expecting in secularism this year, from the courts to Congress. So joining me today is attorney Kat Grant, who has a fellowship here at FFRF through Equal Justice Works. And as always, you can ask questions in the Facebook comments, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. So first, the first session of the 118th Congress convened yesterday. Didn't get much done, but let's talk about what we are looking at this year in legislation. So Kat, why don't you give us a little preview?
Yeah, so this year, a lot of our focus is going to be on the state level. Since the Dobbs decision, a lot of key issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, all of those big issues have really been kicked back to the states. So pretty much every state is going to have something we need to watch out for. So what we really, really want to encourage is that everyone sign up for our action alerts, which you can do by going to our website, ffrf.org, emailing info@ffrf.org, or by becoming a member. By signing up for these alerts, you will receive information from our strategic response team with key information on upcoming legislation that needs acting upon. So right now, in this probably exact moment, the biggest thing that we really need to look at is Texas. So Texas is weird in that the legislature only meets from January to May every other year. So they just really, really rapidly will just start, going through a bajillion different bills all at once. Right now, we are tracking more than 100 pre-filed bills in Texas right now over all of the topics that we're about to cover. So we're looking at a few different legislative trends this year. So obviously at the very, very top of the list are abortion and reproductive rights. So not just abortion, but also birth control and access to sterilization and other medications. We are looking at LGBTQIA+ issues, parental rights, and private school vouchers. Those are the big focus areas we're looking at right now. So in the reproductive sphere, we're going to see a continuation of what we've seen post-Dobbs. So, we saw right after Dobbs, a bunch of states suddenly really rapidly pass abortion bans or attempt to pass abortion bans or otherwise severely restrict abortion access. Anti-abortion legislators are also getting a lot more creative. They're starting to realize how unpopular abortion bans actually are. We saw in Kansas, they full-on rejected a constitutional amendment. So in Missouri, we're looking at SB 290, which would impose a 2% tax on higher education institution endowments that are affiliated with or provide medical faculty to any abortion facility. And that term is defined in section 188.015. So if they offer medical residencies or fellowships that offer training in performing or inducing abortions, if they support in any manner any kind of abortion facility where abortions are performed or induced when not necessary to save the life of the mother. This is...
Wow.
Yeah. This is one of those, they realize, okay, maybe a ban is not necessarily the best thing to do. But if we say, well, if a college with a medical school is training their students or providing residents or fellows that provide abortion, we're going to tax their endowments, which endowments are millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Right. 2% is a huge number.
Yeah. So that's one of the ways that they're really starting to get creative in terms of trying to really ban abortion. We also are going to see this fight expand into emergency contraceptives like Plan B and Ella. We're going to look at birth control as well as other medications and treatments. This fight about abortion is not just about abortion, because we saw right after the Dobbs decision, a lot of medications that are used for autoimmune disorders and chronic pain disorders are also used in abortion cases.
Right. And
we saw a lot of people being denied access to that medication in the confusion. So we're looking at that across the country right now. Those are really, really big in a lot of different states.
Right.
On the LGBT front, we have a whole bunch of things, and this is sort of my area of expertise. This is what my fellowship project is about. So we're looking at a continuation of Don't Say Gay bills like we saw in Florida, which would prevent any kind of education in public schools on gender, sexuality, really sex ed of any kind. We've also seen a lot of bans on gender-affirming care, and these often take the form of SAFE Acts, which stands for Saving Adolescents from Experimentation, which is essentially just saying, hey, we're going to ban gender-affirming care for minors, and that could look like not just puberty blockers, but also buying children clothing that matches their assigned gender, calling them by their, preferred name or pronouns, getting them a haircut. So that's really at the top of what a lot of states are doing right now.
Kat, can I interrupt just
Yes.
to ask, do you know if these SAFE Acts, the way that they're sort of being structured in different states, are they attempting to only regulate the medical profession, or are they attempting to regulate like parental action?
So it's kind of not quite a 50-50. The biggest place that we are seeing parental action being regulated right now is Texas. So Texas, amongst their millions of pre-filed bills that we're dealing with right now,
Right.
Had, I believe, 2 different bills that tried to classify gender-affirming care as child abuse. This is something that we have seen Texas has been doing over the past couple of years. We have talked about it quite a bit. We know that parents and families are starting to flee Texas. States like New York and California are starting to pass sanctuary laws in response to this to make sure that these families can't be extradited back to Texas. So that's really where we're looking at parental regulation. But the bulk of what we're looking at right now is really at medical care. So we're also looking at bans on using things like Medicaid for gender-affirming care, not only for minors, but also for adults.
Wow.
We are starting to push into, this is the direction we've seen it going, we are starting to push into also, full-grown adults having their bodily autonomy and medical choices being negated. We are also looking at bans on drag performances, or really, really strict regulation of drag performances. Another one of the bills we're looking at in Texas would classify any and all drag performances, regardless of the actual content of the performance, as a sexual performance and a sexual act, and therefore would be regulated in the same way as like strip clubs. So no one over the age of 18, or no one under the age of 18, would be permitted to enter these establishments or like go to a drag performance, even if it's like a drag story time, or the owner of the establishment can be charged with a misdemeanor.
Unreal.
Yeah, so we're seeing that in kind of the broader attack on drag. Texas is the big one, but we're seeing this on the state and also local levels. A lot of like city and county councils have been like starting to push ordinances against drag shows in their towns and counties. On the school board level, as well as the state level, we're also starting to see a lot more policies providing teachers with religious exemptions to using students' preferred pronouns or preferred names. And we're starting to see what directions those fights are going to go in. We're waiting for some decisions from the 7th Circuit and other courts, but we are seeing an increase of those. We're also looking at, talking about students, a lot of book bans. And this kind of goes into our next area of parental rights, where we are seeing over and over again bans on books on gender diversity, race, books that discuss sexuality, books that discuss abortion. Pretty much anything that you could think of as controversial is being banned. Similarly, we're seeing curriculum opt-ins and opt-outs, which is basically giving parents the choice to decide what their students learn, rather than, teachers and educational experts who have, a lot of times master's degrees in these topics, which can make not only talking about things like race and history and gender and sexuality difficult, but also issues like evolution is really, really going to be at risk. So we're seeing a lot of the progress we've seen in the educational sphere being rolled back. Another major issue we're seeing is a lot of these educational regulations and these parental choice regulations are requiring teachers, counselors, school administrators to out students to their families. And it's a very blanket policy without any concern as to whether or not that might actually be safe. So education is going to become a very, very contentious space, more so than it already has been. And it's not just public schools that we're watching, because we're also watching private school vouchers.
Right.
So this passed a little under the radar for a lot of people because this past Supreme Court term was a nightmare. But Carson v. Mankin came down over the summer. And basically, the important thing to know about that case is that basically any school voucher program, according to the Supreme Court, if it funds any kind of private school, also has to fund religious private schools. You cannot say, we're not going to fund religious private schools. So what we're going to see are a lot more voucher programs funding religious schools.
Right. This is public dollars, tax dollars, going to support either tuition reimbursements or any manner of, machinations used to funnel public money into private religious school coffers.
Right. Another really big thing that we're starting to see, and we've seen this over and over again, this isn't really new, but it's starting to get pushed more, are bills centered around the use of "In God We Trust," which is the national motto, even in states that already have laws about using it. So Pennsylvania and South Carolina are both attempting to place "In God We Trust" in every building operated by state funds, as well as in every single public school classroom.
Wow.
Because that needs to be everywhere, apparently.
That's an amazing use of your legislative energy and tax dollars.
Yeah.
Love it.
And then lastly, on the federal level, well, there's lots of things going on the federal level. The biggest thing we're watching is, of course, Supreme Court reform. So we here at FFRF are supporters of both expansion and ethics standards. So expanding the Supreme Court, placing more justices on the court, as well as actually, creating a set of ethics or holding them to the same ethics standards that lower court judges are held to. Because currently, there are no real official standards that the Supreme Court needs to be held to in terms of ethics, and we are seeing how that is playing out in real time.
Just friendly reminder to Americans everywhere, the Supreme Court is bound by no rules of professional conduct. So we all, as lawyers and even as lower court judges and nurses and teachers and all the things that we do in our professional lives, we adhere to a professional code of conduct, and we abide by professional ethics. And if we violate those rules of professional conduct, there are consequences, and the Supreme Court is above all that. They have no rules of professional conduct that guide their behavior as a judge, and they have no ethical rules or standards by which anyone can review their actions or decision-making or conflicts of interest or any of those things. So that's a big deal. For obvious reasons, that makes sense to all of us that agree to abide by rules in our professions. So that is a great segue into another thing that we want to preview for 2023. So that's legislation 2023. Just to recap what Kat said, we're not going to see a lot of federal legislating probably this upcoming couple of years because now we're in divided government. So a lot of that is going to be at the state level. But of course, we are always watching the Supreme Court for upcoming Supreme Court decisions. Most of orders of the court for this term, 22-23, will come down this summer. It's usually mid-June to late June. You all probably remember last summer, which was a cascade of horrible decisions and nightmares.
It was a great time to be studying for the bar exam, I'll tell you that much.
Yeah. It was a doozy, and this term is actually just as consequential. This court continues to take cases that have the potential to have a sweeping impact or to undermine decades of Supreme Court precedent. So there are less direct impact on religion clause cases than last year. When you remember, we had 3 directly affecting the religion clauses last year. So there's a little bit of a breather on the actual religion clause cases, but there's really still huge potential for harm with the cases that are being heard right now in this term and that we're going to be seeing decisions in this summer. So The case FFRF is watching most closely, we've discussed on this show at length, you and I in particular, that's 303 Creative versus Alanis. That's the case out of Colorado. If you haven't heard us in this space talking about the case before, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case last month, and it involves once again, it involves the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, CADA, which requires businesses that are open to the public not to discriminate on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. This case involves a website design company or graphic design company in Colorado that doesn't currently sell wedding websites but wants to expand into that space, but is being prevented by doing so because she does not want to be required by CADA to provide that service to same-sex couples. So the question that the Supreme Court has agreed to review is specifically her free speech claim, which is whether her website design company has a First Amendment free speech right to refuse to sell wedding websites to same-sex couples while selling that same product and service to opposite-sex couples. And also at issue under Colorado law is whether she can advertise her intent to discriminate in that way, which is also against the law in Colorado and other states. So the oral arguments more or less centered on whether or not this is in fact a status-based denial of service. We talked about this and vented about it a lot last month. But it does seem like the conservative supermajority is really poised to certainly find in favor of the web design company and really curtail the potency of Colorado's anti-discrimination law specifically as it applies to protecting LGBTQ citizens. But we don't know yet kind of on what basis they will pull that hat trick. I think most likely is to call it a non-status-based decision, which, we discussed why that is utter BS, but.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the most likely direction that they're going to take with this, is say, it's not because you're willing to sell things to gay people, such as animal rights websites.
Right.
It's not status-based. It's just a content-based distinction. And so they're going to do judicial hand-waving to try and make it okay. And it's not going to be, but that's the most likely outcome.
So and we talked about this also in our 303 episode, but if you remember the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision that was, I think, in 2018. And this is really the Supreme Court kind of picking up where that case left off. And they couldn't really find in that case in a sweeping way on the merits. That was really an almost identical case with a baker in Colorado that not wanted to discriminate, but actually had discriminated against an actual same-sex couple who brought a complaint under the Anti-Discrimination Act and went through that whole process. And the Supreme Court reviewed that case and did a punting, sidestepping the major issues and found for the baker, but on non-sweeping constitutional grounds, more of procedural grounds. But 2018 was a very long time ago, and this is a completely different makeup of the Supreme Court. And now there is a very strong majority to find in a sweeping way that business owners who have a religious objection to selling wedding services to same-sex couples have a free speech right not to. This is so hard to even say because it's so stupid. Have a free speech right not to communicate approval of the same-sex marriage by selling their wedding wares to the same-sex couple. That's about the size of it. And incredibly, that is where this court is heading, which is just a further massive expansion of the religious and religious speech rights of conservative Christians at the expense of the civil rights of LGBTQ Americans. So we're watching to see how that case turns out, but don't expect a favorable ruling. It's kind of not a question of if, it's a question of how they will really undermine our state's anti-discrimination laws, especially as they apply to LGBTQ Americans. And that is also something you saw signaled at oral arguments, was these judges just want to tell us all, foist onto all of us, the idea that there is just something different about race and other protected classes and other protected status-based forms of discrimination, and that exists with sexual orientation and gender identity. And even though we have decided in our states via the democratic process to protect these groups in the same way, the court just seems like it is determined to tell us that race is different and ethnicity is different, but sexual orientation and gender identity is just not on that same level and deserving of protection. So that's terrible, and we're watching for that probably late in the decision schedule, because that was a very...
Yeah, I imagine it'll be towards the very end.
Late June.
Late June, probably within the last 3 that they'll probably drop, is what I would guess.
Agreed. That was a big case, and it's certainly controversial. So there aren't any other cases pending directly, like I said, affecting the religion clauses, but there are a lot of big decisions on deck. So we're watching for the court's decisions on hugely consequential cases, such as one where the court is pretty much poised to end affirmative action. The court certainly seems ready to further eviscerate the already eviscerated Voting Rights Act. There's another case that pertains to the Voting Rights Act and what's left of the Voting Rights Act to protect race-based restrictions on voting. And there's a case that's really scary that the court is hearing that is about stopping the ability of state courts to review state legislatures' electoral maps. There are state legislatures that are claiming they have, under the constitutional language, absolute authority to draw electoral maps, and that their own state courts, not federal courts, their own state courts have no power to review those electoral maps or to make sure that they comport with the state and federal constitutions. If the Supreme Court buys that argument, that is a huge sweeping change to checks and balances that exist in these states. And obviously the electoral process is hugely impacted by the inability of anyone, any court, any constitutional authority to review electoral maps, which are very often drawn in racist and, of course, partisan ways. So that's really decisions we're watching this year from the Supreme Court. But another thing we wanted to kind of highlight and preview, like I said, is the makeup of the federal courts. How might that change this year? So like I said earlier, after the 2022 midterms, the new Congress is divided. And so the passage of any bills will have to go through both houses, both chambers, and is going to require bipartisanship because the House is now in Republican control. The Senate remains in control of the Democrats. We saw the first day of the session. It was not a very fruitful business was not conducted. They still have yet to elect a Speaker of the House. Oh, wow. I'm hearing they're still working on that one.
They're still voting. MSNBC broke out Steve Kornacki from his containment chamber to explain what's going on.
So the long and short of that is we don't expect a lot to get done in a divided Congress. But the Senate, again, is all that's needed to advise and consent and confirm judges to the federal courts. And so the White House will be able to move ahead with confirming judges to vacancies on the federal bench. So what is really been talked about a lot in the past few weeks is that Biden's judicial nominees so far have actually outpaced President Trump's at this point in his presidency. So around 97 of Biden's, and this is changing week by week, so I'm hedging, but of Biden's judicial nominees have been confirmed, and that's compared to about 83 at this point, at roughly this point in Trump's presidency. And there are 79 open seats and 30 announced vacancies. That means judges that have said, I'm going to retire at X date in the future, but they're still sitting. So if Biden and the Senate can fill all of those seats, there will then be 203-ish Biden judicial nominees confirmed. And that's compared to around 245 Trump and Republican appointments through 4 years. So that's actually going to go a long way to helping rebalance the Supreme Court from all of the appointments that were held from the prior administration and just jammed through in the 4 years of the Trump presidency. And the really exciting thing about what's possible for the judicial appointments in the next couple of years is that so far, nearly 3/4 of Biden's nominees have been women. Almost 2/3 of them have been people of color. And a really important part of this diversity picture is professional diversity. So Biden has made a point to nominate lawyers who have historically underrepresented careers on the federal bench, and that means former public defenders, former civil rights lawyers, lawyers who have represented, non-corporate interests, so consumer protection lawyers. And that's important because there has been a shocking lack of professional diversity on the federal bench, which means that most of the judges that are hearing these hugely consequential cases only have one sort of professional experience in their background, and that is usually a corporatist, corporate law. It's like I'm trying to think of another one, but not representing the little guy in any of these types of areas of law. So criminal defendants, consumers, small plaintiffs, and I think that is something that's going to really help diversify the way that judges are hearing and approaching these cases and understanding the human impact of the decisions that the federal courts make. So that's an exciting thing that will continue into 2023 as the Senate hopefully is able to keep pushing and accelerating appointments to these vacancies.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize how important these positions are, because these are not the types of things that tend to make the news. Your average American knows what the Supreme Court is, maybe knows what federal judges are, but these are really, really critical because they really define the landscape of what cases even make it up to the Supreme Court. And you think about, the Supreme Court only takes a handful of cases every year, but there are so many more cases that stop at the federal level, and that becomes essentially what the law is until we get at least a more clear answer. So I really, really want to emphasize how important it is to call your senators, get in contact with your senators and tell them the kind of judges you want to see on the federal bench. That's an incredibly, incredibly critical piece of advocacy that every single person can do. So just really want to emphasize, you might not know that much about the system, but it is incredibly important.
Yeah, so true. So it is mostly district court vacancies that, so that's the lowest trial court level in the federal system that the Biden administration has managed to fill. There's not as many circuit court vacancies as the prior administration had, but it is steady and it is important. And those district court level judges make, like you said, a lot of decisions that just affect the parties involved that never end up, being the types of cases that are ripe for even appellate review, but that really impact the actual parties to the case. And I'm thinking specifically of federal criminal cases. It makes a big difference to have, and this shouldn't be the case, and that's a whole nother episode. But it makes a really big difference if you have a former public defender who has a worldview and who has life experience and professional experience that understands all aspects of a criminal case, and who has a respect for constitutional rights and civil rights of everyone involved in a criminal case. Hearing that case at the district court level, that's something that's very unlikely to ever, be an issue for the circuit courts of appeals or the Supreme Court, but it matters a lot who's sitting in that district court judge seat, to the parties and to all of the people that live in the district in which that judge sits. And so it's important, it matters to you, who is the judge sitting in your federal district. So yes, that is something that senators vote on and have a lot of say in. And as such, they report to us and we can tell them what we want to see in our district court judges. So I'm going to stop there. It's on the half hour so that we can see if we have any questions and see what else we can talk about or answer for a year in review. Yeah, I'm going to do a shout out to our viewer from Yemen, I just heard. Let's talk about court reform. You mentioned that in your legislative update as like something that is that FFRF is watching in the federal space. Do you think, given divided government, there is any hope of any progression towards any type of court reform?
Well, I think, to quote the great philosopher Justin Bieber, never say never. But honestly, I'm not super confident on it. I think it's something that we can't give up on. I think that's really the biggest thing on court reform and a lot of these other issues, is that we can't just stop and say, oh, well, nothing's going to get done, so why are we even bothering? There is something to like saving energy and being strategic,
right?
But you have to continue to be loud. You have to continue talking about it. You have to continue keeping it in the public consciousness. And so I think as we see these things progress, as long as we keep talking about it, we've seen that especially court expansion has become more and more popular. It was a really, really controversial thing, and it's becoming less and less controversial as we are seeing, different things come through the court, and we're seeing the rise of, this really, really extremist court. We are seeing expansion really become more and more popular. So I think as long as we keep talking about it, that eventually is going to put enough pressure on Congress. Hypothetically, that's how the democratic process is supposed to work, at least. So I think the more we talk about it, the more likely it is to happen, but I'm not confident, at least in the next year, that it will happen.
Agree with that. Okay, I've got some questions pulled up here. So here we go. Ann B asks, is there any good news? Are there any places where legislation is moving in the right direction? Do we have any thoughts on that?
So the biggest things that are coming to mind are states like New York and California that I mentioned are passing sanctuary laws to ensure that families fleeing states like Texas, and we can probably assume at this point that other similar states are going to start passing, these gender-affirming care as child abuse type of laws, where, families are trying to find a better place to live. So I think that's really helpful to see, even if it's a little dystopian. We also are seeing things fail. We saw in Kansas a constitutional amendment to ban abortion failed.
Oklahoma as well?
Yes.
And I mean, these are not your Californias and your New Yorks.
Right.
So, I mean, these are questions that are being put directly to voters in ballot initiatives, asking the question directly of voters, not legislators. Basically, do you approve of this abortion ban or whatever it may be?
Right. We also saw in Ohio, of all places, a trans sports ban failed very, very recently. And that was very much to the point I made at the very beginning, that state-level advocacy works. If you get engaged with your state-level process, that is what is going to push legislation in the right direction. There was a ton of output from trans people, from allies, from families, from students. You know, you had kids going to the Ohio legislature and saying, this is going to hurt me. And that is what pushes the good legislation. So we are seeing, even in these more conservative areas and these areas where we're not always anticipating the good stuff, we are seeing that the pressure is working. So I think that's really the biggest thing, is just keep engaging, don't give up, don't give in to the apathy machine.
Right on. Okay, here's another question. While gender-affirming care being banned through Medicare is already problematic, will legislators be able to, or are they going to take those sorts of restrictions to commercial health insurance as well? This is a little weedsy, but I think the question is there a way for legislators to restrict gender-affirming care through commercial health insurance?
I don't think, and I'm kind of going through this in my brain, I think the most likely way that they are going to go about this is by pushing litigation similar to what we're seeing with birth control. I think that is going to be very similar, where like the Hobby Lobby decision, it's going to be based on employer decisions and whether or not employers want to, provide health insurance that covers, in this case, birth control. We're looking at gender-affirming care. We're already seeing this in the Fifth Circuit last year. There was a case where PrEP, which is a medication that both prevents HIV infections and prevents it from progressing if you're already infected. The Fifth Circuit said, you know what, insurance providers and like employers do not have to cover that if it goes against their religious beliefs. So I think that's the more likely tact that they're going to go for. I think it would be very, very difficult. The only other thing I could think of is if the FDA suddenly becomes extremely, extremely conservative and decides things like HRT and surgeries are terrible and bad, even though we've had the science for years and years and years showing that they are not.
Right. Agreed. So this kind of, I should have read this first, but I didn't see it because it's last, because we were riffing on court expansion. But here's a question from Facebook. Do you think there's a reason President Biden isn't trying to pack the court to stop the clearly religious extremist Supreme Court? So when we talk about court reform and even court expansion, we're not necessarily here at FFRF just talking about adding seats or otherwise expanding or changing the makeup of the Supreme Court. We're also talking about something that is sort of as like basic as administrative expansion of the lower federal courts. In other words, the federal courts have not been expanded to include more courts and more judges to keep up with caseloads in like decades now, I think. At least 20 years, maybe 30 years. So there's already just a burden, and if you practice in federal courts, you know this, there's an incredible burden on all of the federal courts' caseloads. There just aren't enough courts to keep up with the number of federal cases. That is something that Congress can do. That's basically an administrative duty of theirs that they haven't done. That would dilute the power of the federal courts, but for a valid administrative reason, which is we need more courts because we don't have enough courts to hear the cases that we have. So that's court expansion, but that doesn't involve adding seats or doing anything that would change the makeup of the Supreme Court. But of course, one of the things that we do advocate is changing the makeup of the United States Supreme Court to make it less concentrated in its power. So that could be adding seats to the Supreme Court, which is not as controversial as people would have you believe. It's been done several times in American history. There's no place where it's written in like the founder's blood. Yeah,
there's no number in the Constitution as to how many Supreme Court justices there need to be.
So there's nothing sacred about 9 Supreme Court justices. And there's this idea, and I rant about this, I feel like all the time, but there's this sort of idea, and I think the Supreme Court justices themselves have perpetuated this to a large degree, that somehow the Supreme Court is like above the like political process, or like they're just like they sit on high in a sense that they're like above the constitutional order. But the reality is they are one of three concurrent branches of government. They are a part of the constitutional order, which is built on, as we all learned in the 4th grade, checks and balances. That includes the United States Supreme Court, which is one of three co-equal branches of government. In other words, there are, and there should be, and we should be happy that there are, checks and balances on the court. What are those checks and balances? Well, that is the control that the United States Congress has over the makeup of the Supreme Court. So that means that they could pass legislation that changes the number of Supreme Court justices or how they hear cases, the jurisdiction that they have, what types of cases that they can't hear, what types of issues fall under their jurisdiction or not. They have a lot of control over how the Supreme Court operates. It's not that the Supreme Court is just a holier-than-thou institution of our government and they're independent and we should be so happy that they are because that means that they're pure. Obviously, that is not the way it is. That's not the way it was intended to be. So we support court reform in all of its possibilities for bringing about the most democratic result when it comes to what we're hearing out of the court. When the court gets out of step with what the American people want, there is meant to be checks and balances that will bring it back into line. And we are certainly at a point in American history where the court is wildly out of step with what the American people would have in a lot of these areas of law, most notably abortion and Dobbs, but not by any means the only area or issue where the court is far afield of what Americans by and large would want. So I do think adding seats to the Supreme Court is, for whatever reason, considered to be a very extreme political thing to do. And so it's not surprising that President Biden is not full force.
Doesn't seem to be where this administration currently wants to spend the political capital they have. And I think that's another big reason why with the split Congress, I'm not super confident we're going to see anything until at least the next election.
Right.
Because I think there are so many issues and there's very limited political capital to spend, and it's become even more limited. So I think they're going to focus on things that are less controversial, even though it's Supreme Court expansion is becoming less and less controversial.
Right, exactly. Okay, I think that was our last question. I'm a little delayed on my reloading, but that's good because it's quarter of. So that will just conclude Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much, Kat, and thank you all for joining us. Be sure to check out Free Thought Matters, our broadcast TV show. This week, Dan Barker speaks to former Christian musician Andre Forbes. Dan and Andre collaborated to create The Godless Gospel, which had its debut performance at FFRF's recent convention in San Antonio, Texas. Here's a preview.
Nobody owns the rights to the actual style of gospel music. So me being atheist now, I put my dues in Christianity, I'll say that first. But me not having those same beliefs anymore, that doesn't mean that I can no longer play this style anymore and no longer write my own songs or compose my own lyrics and, put everything on top. It just means that it's evolved from what people have known it to be.
You don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to be ashamed of who you are. Never be ashamed.
Free Thought Matters is on the air across the United States, and you can also see it on FFRF's YouTube and Facebook channels. Also, be sure to check out Free Thought Radio with Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker. This week, they feature an interview with Saturday Night Live alumna Julia Sweeney. Go to ffrf.org/radio to find out how to hear Free Thought Radio. Last but not least, there is a new episode of We Dissent. One came out just before Christmas, and another will come out mid-January. The latest episode covers the 303 Creative case and what we heard at oral arguments. So check it out wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you next week with a new episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.